The first item we're going to make is the dropper for the coupling. There's a little plastic sleeve over the pin. I'll keep that on there so that you don't accidentally catch your finger on the pin at some other stage of the work. It can be very painful. Take a piece of wire, we need to cut it to length. On the jig, if we put the wire to the black block here, hold it in place and cut it to approximately the length of the jig, using the edge of the jig as a guide. It's not critical, within a couple of millimeters isn't a problem, but if you make it too long you can find there's difficulty in doing the loop bend subsequently because there's too much spare wire. We're going to anchor the wire into the hole in the jig, so we bend a tail just a little less than the depth of the jig, right angles in the wire, and that is going to go into the hole and anchor the wire when we do the bending. At the other end we need to be able to grip the wire, so we'll put a small 1.5 millimeters or so bend in the wire in the opposite direction, so we end up with a Z-shaped piece of wire. One end of the wire has the anchor, the other end has the hold for gripping the wire as we bend it. We drop the wire into the jig with the end of the wire into the hole and the wire passing round the back of the pin. Slide the block forward, and there's a groove in the bottom of the block that will go over the wire and stop it coming out of the hole when you bend it. We take the bending tool that we made earlier, place it over the end of the wire, and then very gently twist it round. Don't pull too hard or you'll end up snapping the pin out. Once it's round, you can then tighten it up, let go, and we've got a nice little loop formed. Slacken the block off, and then we quietly and carefully lift the wire out. Very careful here, because if it pings it will disappear into the carpet and it will only be found a long while later when you tread on it. We'll close the loop up with a pair of pliers. Again, gently. If you squeeze too hard, the wire can shear against the loop, and then you're left with a little loop and a piece of wire and no loop on the end. Not a lot of use for anybody. There's a spare piece of wire now that was held by the bending tool. Put the coupling, the dropper, into the pliers and slide it along till the loop just touches the jaws. Put your finger over the end of the piece you're going to cut off so it doesn't fly. Keep your finger out of the jaws. Cut it off. Normally that would have stuck in your finger. On this occasion it went flying across here, but I can find it so nobody's going to tread on it. We're left then with a dropper, wire, loop at the end. There's a little tail still to grind off. We'll grind that off later when the coupling's assembled and it's easier to hold. The next stage is to bend the hook. We'll use this end of the jig and we'll slacken off the blade first of all. Underneath the blade you can see a small hole into which the wire will go, and that will hold it at the correct angle for bending. We're going to use this end as the reference for cutting the wire. So we'll take the wire, hold it against the sliding block, making certain that the sliding block has been pushed fully home to the front of the jig. Again, not critical but about the right length. Cut it against the end of the jig, and we're left with a piece of wire which looks as though it's cut too short, but in fact it will do. It must have slipped as I was holding it. Not critical. In some cases you'll want a wire that's short anyway because you're dealing with a very close couple. About 10mm off the end of the wire I'll start a bend. That's going to be the hook end and the other is going to be the shank end. Insert the shank end into the hole, hold it down and then ease it firmly in to ensure that we get a good tight bend to that angle. Flatten it down with a screwdriver, but don't dig the end of the screwdriver in, otherwise there's a risk of you stressing the wire and shearing it. When we've finished we should end up with a wire which is just over a right angle. This one's gone a little slack actually, so I'm going to ease it manually a touch more to about there, and then try it back into the hole. Just to check the angle, and the angle's looking pretty good. Hold it in place, slide the blade down as far as it will go and tighten that up. As I did that I noticed that the plastic sleeve dropped off, and I'm going to put that back in before I catch my finger on it and jag myself. There's a little slot here which enables you to get a screwdriver under the end of the wire. Don't try and lift the wire with your finger initially or you'll put it straight through your finger end. Lift it with the screwdriver and then you can roll your finger over and pull that round against the blade. Again, smooth it down and smooth it from the blade onto the jig. If you do it the other way you're likely to stress that point on the end of the wire, and when you do that the wire will then shatter, in which case you've got to make another hook. We'll undo that, swing the bar to one side and carefully remove the hook. We now have a hook, reasonable shape at pretty much the right angle, and we can then move on now to the next stage of the operation. Place the hook on top of the jig so that you can see better exactly what it looks like. Now the hook isn't quite in line with the shank, there's a very slight bend on it. So what we'll do is to straighten that out. We hold the hook in a pair of flat jawed pliers, and you can probably see that the shank is slightly at an angle with the jaws. So what I do is just ease the shank round until it appears to be parallel to the jaws. Needs perhaps a touch more there. And we're then left with a hook which, when you sight down, is near enough in line with the shank. Not perfectly, but it's close enough. So at that stage we then have a hook which we're going to use with the dropper to make a full Electra coupling. The next job is to join the two parts together. We take the hook and the dropper. With the dropper, hold the tail in your left hand. That keeps the loop round in the correct direction. Take the hook and slide the hook through the hole. We're then left with the dropper hanging on the hook. Slacken the sliding part of the jig off quite loose, because we're going to try and tuck the tail of the dropper under there, which will go eventually. Try and turn the hook round in the right direction, and if we're lucky we can lower that in and slide the block up. The block is now gripping the dropper with its tail firmly under the block and holding the hook, the loop vertical, and it's got the hook held horizontally between the sliding block and the top block. We can then slide the hook around to one way or the other to get the distance from the loop to the bend to suit what the type of rolling stock we're attaching it to. Wagons, it would be a shorter distance. With coaches we might need to move it out a millimetre or so. There is clearance in the jig to enable that hook to be adjusted a millimetre or so in total. We tighten up everything. We now have the Electra held in the correct orientation and spacing. Take a small amount of flax, place it on the loop. I'm using Carr's Green Label, which is very good for guitar wire, or at least it's very good for soldering guitar wire. I don't suppose it's very good for the long-term life of the wire. A fair bit of solder on the iron won't matter, because there's only a very small amount of loop into which we're going to solder, so it'll only take off what it can use. Touch it onto the loop, and then we'll inspect it. We'll have a look down. It hasn't actually quite filled the loop, so I'm going to put a little bit more flux on. And a little bit more, touch more solder on the iron, and we'll try it again. That's better. If we now look down the loop, hopefully you can see that we've formed a little dome on the loop holding the shank in place. Undo the block, slide it back, and hey presto, we have an Electra coupling formed with the hook and the dropper, ready for the next stage of bending. I'll put that on the back and so you can see that quite clearly. At the next stage, what we're going to do is to put a small tube on here, bend a weight on the end of there to act as the counterweight, and take this long shank and bend that shank to the shape needed to work the auto coupling and uncoupling mechanism of the Electra. We now have the two parts together, ready to bend the hook. Hold the tail of the hook and we'll slide the pliers in so that the outer edge of the plier jaw is approximately in line with the bottom of the hook. I'm now looking down on the hook and I can see that the dropper's in line with the hook. With my finger I will now carefully bend the hook up, the dropper end upwards, keeping it slightly to the left hand side of the hook as I look down, and we're going to bend that to about a 75-80 degree angle. So if we now rotate that, you can see that the dropper tail is going to one side. We'll put it down for a minute so you can see that we now have the characteristic shape of the Electra dropper. That's going to form part of the delay mechanism. We now hold the hook, the pliers, the outer face of the jaw parallel to the dropper, just past the bottom of the hook so that the bottom of the hook goes into the plier jaw. And we're going to bend this up now so that we have the little angled return which ensures the droppers pass clear of each other in the delay position. So we've bent that up now, and that's bent to be approximately parallel to the main shank of the hook, and it's at about 45 degrees. So if we put that down, I can hold it in place and you can see how the hook runs through and how that comes up at about 45. Look at it from on top and you can now see the characteristic shape where the dropper is just across on one side of the hook and the bottom is coming out at 45. We're now going to cut that off about 1/2 millimetre, 3/4 millimetre onto the dropper tail, grip it gently in the cutters and then put a finger round to stop the other end flying. Click. We have one waste piece of scrap. That'll go in a mineral wagon for scrap waste to the nearby scrap yard, whatever that is called. We now look down on top of the hook to see that the dropper is correctly positioned just to one side. If it turns out that the dropper and the hook line up in a straight line, you can just hold the hook with the pliers and gently bend the end of the dropper round so that the dropper sticks to the left and then to the right. So at this stage we now have a completed Electra hook. All we need to do is to find a way of making it fit a wagon. The next stage is to ensure that the hook can be mounted on the wagon. The way we do this is to place it into a tube which acts as the pivot, and the hook will then pivot freely in there, and we bend the end of the hook round with a little lead weight on the end, and that acts as a counterbalance to keep the hook into the correct orientation. One item we have made, which is easy to do, is a block of timber, small piece, doesn't really matter what, with a little steel rod about 3 millimeters in diameter set into it with a dimple drilled in the end. That is so we can take our little piece of lead weight and hold it simply in a place. If we try and put that on without something to control the lead weight, it will roll all over the place and you'll spend a happy 10 minutes looking for it on the floor, until you put your hand inadvertently on one of the pieces of cut off wire that you left on the floor, and then the neighbours will know all about it. So we'll take our tube. It's cut from fine bore tube. This one I think is 0.3 diameter, but 0.4 would do just as well. The smaller the diameter up to a point, the better, because then the wire has less slack. With a long tube, the slack isn't so important. If you're trying to fit these into a very limited space behind the buffer beam, then the tube will be short and the wire needs to be as close a fit as you can. You'll see that the end of the tube is slightly chamfered, so that there's no point where the coupling can easily catch. Slide the tube on to the coupling, up to the hook, hold the coupling, and then you can gently push down on the tube to hold it hard on the coupling. You'll see I'm holding the hook facing directly into me. I can then bend the end towards me, but at 45 degrees. That's the angle we want to ensure the hook turns to the correct coupling angle under the weight. We can now hold that tube in the pliers, and you'll see that the hook can balance. It's free moving, no resistance on it, so we know that's fine. In order to retain the weight, we can hold about 1.5 mm, 2 millimeters, depending on the clearance you have under the wagon, and bend the end of the hook. Once you've started to bend, you can use your finger. But trying to bend it initially, you're going to push the wire through your finger. Not a good idea. So we now have a hook bent roughly at 90 degrees at the end. We'll just double check that the freedom of movement is fine. It is. We've already placed our little lead weight in the end of the bar. We'll find some sticky. I've actually got gel here, but for this particular one, non-gel is probably better. Put a little bit on the end of the wire. Remember to keep it clear of the tube, because you don't want everything stuck together. The real purpose is not to actually hold it to the wire, but to hold it there long enough so that you can take a pair of pliers and squeeze it onto the end of the wire. It's actually squashing the lead weight onto the wire that holds it in place. The glue was merely an aid to ensure it stayed there, and obviously once the glue has gone off, then it will act as a restraint. You can now see that as it operates, the weight pulls it back to 45 degrees. In operation, when you're uncoupling, the magnet will pull that dropper to vertical, and as soon as the wagons are clear of each other, then the weight brings it back to the 45 degrees. So at this stage, we now have a hook with a suitable length tube to fit the wagon. All we need now is a wagon to place this coupling on. We found ourselves a wagon, so we're going to mount the coupling on this wagon. Some kits have a little plate platform in here, either a platform or a plate, some form of support onto which you can place the coupling directly. This particular kit didn't have, so we need to make up a little block that will fit into there. I've made this out of a small piece of brass strip, and to make fitting the coupling easier, I've cut a little notch in the end of it, which will clip to the back of the hook on the wagon, and you'll see there's a little groove just this side of that notch. It's only a very slight groove, but made with a file, and it's about just over 1/4 millimetre, just under 1/2 millimetre from the notch. That will make the positioning of the Electra coupling for its correct offset very easy, because the groove will guide the tube. So what we're going to do is we're going to stick that into the end of the wagon in the right place. You could solder it in, but I find it's probably easier and safer to use a little dollop of super glue, and then just push the plate into place. It made a little click there as it went down, as the end of the hook engaged into the slot. Now that will be ready for the coupling. The coupling we hold by the end, by the hook, and we're going to place it so that the end of the tube is just clear of the buffer beam. And you'll see when you look down that the weight is going to be clear of the wheel flange. Sometimes when you're fitting with a very small amount of room, you need to have a couple of trial runs to ensure that there is room for this weight to fit. You may need to bend the weight forward rather than backward, as this one is, or you may need the tube to pass under the axle and have the weight behind the axle. It doesn't really matter where the weight goes, because the weight is only to bring the hook back to the correct position. It doesn't form any part of the uncoupling apparatus itself, so its location isn't critical. That looks fairly okay. I have actually remembered there's one item we didn't do on here, but it won't matter because the hook was cut so clear. We could have touched the very top of that wire to grind off the piece that's sticking up, but in fact there's probably only about 0.1, 0.2 of a millimetre, and it's not going to be big enough to cause any problems. If it was longer, it could catch on the drawbar hook and cause the coupling to stick. We're now going to place a little piece of super glue into that slot. This is where we managed to stick a screwdriver to the wagon if we're clever. We lower that in, ease it into place, hold it with the screwdriver, and let that set. That's going to take 2 or 3 minutes to set, so in the meantime we'll all have a quick cup of tea. What we now need to do is to check that the coupling works in real life. We have a section of track here, and under these sleepers we have a permanent magnet set. Take the wagon, place it on the track, and as we move it forward, you'll see the magnet draws down the dropper, and at this stage the coupling is now held in a vertical position. I'll see if I can tilt that, and you can see from on top that the coupling is in fact held in a vertical position. The adjacent wagon's coupling will also be pulled down into the same position. Ease it back slightly and then forward again, and the 2 hooks will have disengaged, and as you push forward, instead of that coming up to normal, it will be held in place by the adjacent wagon, and the 2 hooks will be held in a vertical position with the wagons uncoupled. When you stop where you wish to leave the other wagon, you pull back, the 2 droppers disengage, and the hook then returns to normal. You see as we pass over the permanent magnet there, it's pulled down again. If the train is moving forward under load with the hooks held together, The droppers will descend, but the hooks will not pull clear of each other. You have to have that slight reverse movement for the hooks to disengage. So it means that even with permanent wagons you can pull trains across and they won't uncouple. So we'll just try that across and you can see how smoothly it moves down and how smoothly it comes back. Very unobtrusive, very effective. Of course, if you like obtrusiveness, instead of using Electras, you could use something like this. Doesn't that look sweet?